Welcome once again to Syntax Error, your pretentious philosophical pedantic podcast ostensibly about video gaming and related topics therein. Warning, this podcast contains spoilers, mature content, and language. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, welcome back to Syntax Error. I, as always, remain Scott Thurlow, joined tonight by Christopher Morgan.
Good evening.
Jane Manzer.
Hello.
Stephen Amosi.
And I've joined as well.
And now we're all part of a party. And so speaking of that, and this season we've sort of switching off between genres and sort of interesting or relevant articles that I've been uncovering. So tonight we're doing an article, and it is based on a consensus or a survey, sort of like a tally, if you will, from England recently, and it's called "Did You Really Take a Hit? Understanding How Video Games Playing Affects Individuals." So it uses a lot of like surveying data. Go ahead, Steve. Yeah.
If I may, I didn't really get where that name came from in this article.
I think it was
specifically.
This. Well, fine. If you want to discuss the title, I thought it was this. So it's challenging the view that playing video games is sort of like negatively affecting people. So like,
sure.
If you play video games, did you take a hit to your development?
Right. I get it. Never mind.
And then also, of course, it doubles
Question withdrawn.
as an entendre, as you know, like when you're like, no man, that didn't hit me at all. Like,
yeah.
You know. That's how I interpreted it, Steve-O.
I immediately saw it as like
a
pot thing. So
sure. Well, maybe that says something about you.
Yeah.
Beyond this survey.
Dare, Steve-O. Dare.
Cheers, all of our pot smokers out there.
But no, the abstract essentially, I don't read it all out, but I'll have to read some of it to so you get an idea of where why this consensus was conducted or why they used the data that they had from this general. Like it was a general consensus in England, but it also like had enough questions, substantial input that they can use the feedback to drive this survey, essentially, yes.
All right. So, if I remember correctly, there is it's a government agency that does a lot of polling.
Yeah.
And they actually specifically ask them to introduce certain questions.
Exactly, yeah. It's like culturally, like socially, culturally, I believe is the term they use here.
The Department of Cultural, Media, and Sports.
Yeah, and it's called the Taking Part Survey in England, conducted, or this article is from July, so like very recently at time of this recording. Mm-hmm. So regardless, their abstract states that the study is meant to address the important and recurring question of whether video game playing is detrimental to the socio-economic development of a person. It uses novel data from the Taking Part Survey, as I just mentioned, to establish whether game playing is associated with particular socio-economic characteristics and or other forms of cultural participation. The results do not indicate any obviously negative effects of video games playing, as I've always said.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, it seems to show that those who play are typically better educated and no less wealthy, and games players are also more likely to, versus non-games players, to participate in other forms of culture, particularly active, but also including passive forms of cultural participation. These findings are reinforced when comparing characteristics of individuals who did and did not play video games when younger.
Yes.
So, it seems like a very substantial, meaty sort of packet to read, but a lot of it is the graphs that they've used. So I'm going to lay that out right. They took the scientific method, which of course I appreciate and respect. And like they gave, like, if you really want, here's the data, here's the numbers, and here's like the questions they surveyed, and here's like the sort of the sample slice from the survey itself. Yes.
Actually, I would say while reading this, I found that those graphs and things that they had in there were pretty interesting.
Yeah. Were they helpful though? Like, could you interpret them? Because after
reading, you can look at them and see what what they mean.
Sure.
I think so. Definitely check out the article. We'll post it, and then then take a look at the graphs that they have in there.
Fair enough. Yes, Chris.
No, I was going to say the graphs. I found them describing the graphs more helpful than the graphs did, because the math kind of went over my head a little bit.
The graphs are more helpful than the graphs were?
No, the descriptions of the graphs than the graphs themselves.
Sure, the interpretation of them, yes.
Now, here's the thing: is this is not an article or piece of like academic work for the general audience.
Sure,
this is
it's very specific,
addressed at policymakers and on how to. So the graphs, if
Well,
you have
sort of.
they do
mention that. That's true. That's true.
The graphs are for people who read graphs in a way.
Graph readers.
But that's the thing. It's like you have to have a certain knowledge of how they do what weight to put towards certain things, what credences to put towards certain when they're doing probability based on how people
the
address
and so forth of all that, how they ran the numbers. Yes.
Yeah, so,
if you're a graph nerd, you'll really like this.
And I am a graph nerd, so I could look through and understand what they're saying and all this. But if you're not, then the graph's almost nonsensical to you, and you need them to translate it for you.
Yeah, I was somewhat in between, but yes, it's very helpful, and like you said, because of the nature of it. This paper, they have to they must provide you with all the actual raw data and the numbers and how they broke it down. And yes, as it goes through, as they're sort of combing through the data, they will say refer to table X, graph whatever, graph Y, graph 1, picture 1, etc. to tell you where all the numbers came from. And that is very nice that I did it because, of course, it's, like I said, scientific method and lends legitimacy, but my humorous thing is that this backs up everything I've ever felt to be true and have found to be true in at least my personal life, and I think we might all agree with that.
You're not supposed to put personal bias into the scientific method.
You're right. Yep. I'm not supposed to, but this one confirms it, so therefore it's almost like a feedback loop.
But we're not actually conducting the study, so it's
sure. We're just discussing the outcome.
We're just talking about how right
what
it
is.
Said.
Or
so there's a lot of there are a number of sections to this paper, even beyond the graphs as we just mentioned. So I had a number of
past the graphs.
I had a number of quotes and so forth picked out, but there's a lot of them. But I think the most important section would be the analysis or the conclusion. Mm-hmm. So I want to kind of somewhat work backwards a bit. So based on what they've what the numbers have said, it more or less the results were something like this, based on the questions asked. Did you play games when you were younger, and video games specifically, not just games like board games? And so, as a little caveat, I suppose, they did mention that some people made, and Ian's going to bring this up later, but I'll address it now. And the way you interpret that question, some people would think they don't play video games when in fact actually are, depending on your definition of video games. But regardless, it seems to indicate there's a correlation, there's a number of correlations, but I think the main one, the important one that I again, biasedly agreed with, and that this seemed to validate in a sense, is that those who answered the question positively to playing games, video games when growing up, and then a range of other sort of swath of interrelated questions, that it seemed to indicate that if that question was answered in the positive, then you had more of a prevalence or a predilection towards engaging with other cultures, whether actively or passively, as you were, and that's something you want to bring up. But nevertheless, it seems to indicate the fact that if you answered yes, then it was almost if not an imperative, but a factor that drove those individuals to engage in culture at large, whether active or passive, and had more of a affinity or predilection towards engaging in other cultures in general, given that the background was, yes, I played video games when I was younger.
To that point, I found very interesting was how people who play video games are actually more likely to engage in a sense, creative arts.
Mm-hmm. If you That's what, exactly. Perfect segue. That's also I wanted to mention that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because one thing is, Jesus, I always come back to my age. When I started playing video games, it were it was like
Pong.
No, fuck you.
We're gonna talk about Pong now.
I started playing games after Pong. I mean, God damn it, I was into combat and Space Invaders and all that high tech shit. But what happened
all
was
that highfalutin stuff.
No, what happened was Activision came out with things like space. It was some spaceship game like Space Raiders or Bridge Raider, and the gameplay would be so cool, because it was a first person shooter and you're in space and everything, but it lacked a story. And one of the things that
that's why you love text based games.
Well, the text based games were great to a point but they didn't have the graphics to them. So, I mean, from my generation, I think this is reading this is maybe what kind of spurned, the development of games was you would have to create stories internally as to why you were out here doing the same goddamn thing over and over again.
And we discussed that like in a previous episode, a couple episodes back.
But I was just interested
right.
because when I grew up is different from when you guys grew up. So everybody's perception of video gaming is different, and and I agree with you. And what we were talking about outside versus active versus passive, my thing would be active to be more social and passive to be less social. But the way they define it here is active is more of the creative arts and passive to be more of the, going to an art gallery. Attending events, yeah.
Frequently. Sure.
That's a really good point.
So, and so to summary to what you just said, the study notes that, in particular, those who played video games consumed more culture, and this seems to hold true early in life as it does hold now overall.
Now, here's what I would say as kind of an argument to that. The people that had video games, especially when we were growing up, it's not so much the case now, but especially when we were growing up, 25 years ago.
Sure.
The people that had video games had money. And I know this isn't England, it's a different thing, but
in general,
but in general, the people that have money are the people that go and consume culture like that. Yeah. It's not cheap to go see a Broadway play or something like that.
Yes.
Well, speaking of Chris's age,
ooh, my favorite topic.
Now, another point that I really liked, I found very surprised me, was the average age of game players currently.
Oh, I like that one.
I believe it was 41.5.
43.5.
Whatever. Early 40s.
Are you sure? Because I have the study in front of me. Regardless.
I thought it was 43.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah. But still.
41.5 is younger than you.
I would have, if you had asked me this prior to reading the study,
you would have said a lower number for sure.
20s or maybe 30s as the highest point. But 40 as the average age of a game player is, I would never have chosen that.
It's a little bit higher than you probably thought it would have been on the outset, yeah.
It did surprise me at first, but it didn't surprise me when I thought about it because my Atari 2600 was not mine. It was my grandfather's. He bought it. One time I was about to flip the score on Asteroids at home, and my dad and my grandpa were watching me do it. My sister came in to tell us dinner was ready, and they yelled at her. My whole point is, what I'm saying is that
yes,
no, but that even back then, I was finding that older generations were fascinated with this new thing. So as people who are older than me were developing these games, it actually, the more I thought about it in the history of it, that it actually makes a lot of sense that the average game player would be 40.
Chris, I completely agree with that. That's absolutely true. My dad is slightly older than you, and and he is the one that got an Atari for our household. So I had an Atari when I was a little kid.
Sure.
Not because I should have had a Nintendo, but nobody wanted to spend money on that. So for the first 2 or 3 years that Nintendo existed, I was like, oh, I wish that I had a Nintendo, but instead I had an Atari and I played the terrible football game that was on it, or
E.T.
I did not have a E.T. I did not have E.T. Thank.
Interesting. Nobody amongst the person we know had a copy of E.T.
My friend did.
But regardless.
My friend did.
Oh,
and it's
the people that we know. Your friend.
Like I said, people that I personally know. Anyway.
Yeah, I feel like E.T. kind of hit a point really early on where nobody wanted to get it.
Regardless.
Anyway, I'm sorry. That's
no. But I do want to bring a point that
beside the point.
There's in the article itself that you said, Steve-O, brought up earlier, that traditionally observations indicate that high cultural consumption, highs in quotes, is especially prevalent among the elites.
Mm-hmm.
Because through cultural consumption is the very fact that elites have distinguished themselves from not elites,
right?
Essentially. So it's almost like, yes, it's like the nobility versus the peasants in a very broad sense and definition of that.
Well, it's not. It's just that people that have money go and do like fancy art things, and also
time.
They have the money to buy a video game.
I mean, that's always culturally been true. Like regardless, before video games have even existed.
When Nintendo came out, it was like $150 or something like that, and like that's
and for
like
inflation,
$700 system right now.
For sure, you're right about that.
So you just made me think of something that it would be neat to look at this same study maybe 20 years from now when it's not just like because the thing is, like, if you're growing up nowadays, you might not have PS4, you might not have Xbox One or whatever is the current stuff, but you might have a PS2 if you're on a very poor level that's a very affordable nowadays.
A lower scale, sure.
Or PS3
everyone has a computer nowadays, and you playing games on there. So I think that the idea of it being a luxury item for the wealthy,
the gap is like
has
less
narrowed.
Yeah,
so.
exactly.
I completely agree with that.
I absolutely agree with that. As well.
As technology becomes less expensive, it certainly becomes something that is in everybody's household. Like, when we were growing up, it was not unheard of for a person to like have to go to their friend's house to go play a video game or something like that.
Sure.
Me.
Yeah, I did that for Nintendo games. Like, I had an Atari, like I said earlier, and my dad was into computers when I was growing up. So like I always had like a couple of computer like text-based games and stuff like that, and like really
Sure. I know exactly what you mean, yeah.
But like
absolutely.
But I would have to go to other people's houses to play the newest generation games and stuff like that. I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. Like, a lot of times you'll just have that stuff.
As Ian
because
said,
if you get it somewhat after it comes out, not necessarily like buying a PlayStation as soon as it comes out or an Xbox as soon as it comes
the new
out.
console may be.
But like if you get it a year later, it's fairly affordable to get that.
Like,
you can have a couple games or whatever.
The gap is like narrow, like getting more and more like decreased, of course. And same thing, of course. Like I've told the story, like at least something like it on earlier Syntax, where I had one console, but I would go to various friends of mine, and they would have other or more like the same one plus another one, etc.
Right.
That means your exposure, like you're able to like. You're right. It was more of an elitist thing, at least maybe that generation when we were say 10 to 14 or whatever.
But the other thing that's interesting, I was thinking about
decrease since then.
I'm sorry.
I
was thinking about when you were saying, because like now the game consoles are like $400. They're not just game consoles anymore, because you've got the Blu-ray player, you've got the DVD player, you've got the
They're multimedia.
That's a big thing that makes them affordable. Is like they're not just a gaming.
That's
console.
the interesting thing. So instead of buying separate components, maybe you pay $400 for this thing. So you're not ever really just buying the game station.
And that's an interesting socioeconomic aspect.
Whereas before you had to buy a VHS, a Nintendo, like your terrible TV, like a music player.
But wait a minute, but that's another thing comes in, because modern systems, I don't know how compatible they are to older systems, because do they still have the 3-prong thing on like I haven't
That's
checked.
A tangent. But
yes. But it does go to the fact that you might need a certain TV that an Xbox One or a PlayStation 4 might not be.
The thing is, like, all TVs these days work with that stuff.
We're all sharing anecdotal stories.
Yes.
I teach in Patterson. And one of my students got a Raspberry Pi and made it into a game console for all of like the old school games, including like arcade games. Nice. He had like Dreamcast on it. He had a bunch of different things. And it cost, I think, him $100 to buy the Raspberry Pi.
That seems expensive. Like, honestly, it'd probably be less than that.
Or maybe it was the entire thing total.
Sure.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, he using his intelligence, and he comes from a very poor family in Patterson, like, he developed his own console for very cheap. With with what would have, back when we were growing up, have cost for the similar technology,
like 3
would have
times
cost
as much,
us, not even 3
or whatever
times,
it was,
like 100-fold over for the amount of games he had on there.
Yeah.
So it's like you have access to the information if you want it now.
Yeah, the march of technology has, again, as you said, lessened the gap.
Right.
So like that's all very valid and true. So I think that
getting somewhat off topic here, I suppose.
But it's interesting, but it somewhat pertains to this. But I do want to bring up the next point that, of course, I've always biasedly thought to be true, and I've again found in my personal anecdotal experience, if you will, which is that the study says that the probability of playing games is higher for individuals who read, write, or involved in creating some form of digital art, photo, medium, etc., or attend festivals. So that goes to the greater like point at large, where if you grew up playing video games, if you answered positively to that question, that means you were more like likely, in general, to be engaged with other like cultural activities, even if they weren't like related to games per se. Like I think they bring up like libraries, visiting museums, like things like that, or creating something like outright. So, which yes goes to a bit of the division between passive and active participation in culture, but nevertheless, it seems to hold broadly true that if you were in some way playing games when you were younger, that carried over to being broadly open to experiencing other cultural activities.
I mean, if you look at the games now, we bought soundtracks to video games. You listen to soundtrack to video games. We're always talking about the artwork, the stories. And then you have things like GTA where you can drive around and switch the channels and you've got different radio stations. So it's just like, it makes sense because the people that are producing these games are aware of it. So the music is the quality that sure, it would be.
It's become a bigger aspect, like in general, but I'm just saying, like, even beyond that, like, if you're exposed to video game playing, as they keep using that phrase, or playing games, right? It just meant like, it seemed like you were more, it was easier for you to transition into engaging with other cultural aspects at large.
To some extent, I think that is probably valid. But I think that, and as much as I would love to say that I'm so much more cultured for having played video games, I don't think it's causation.
It's not the be all end all.
I don't think it's causation. I think that those two things happen in parallel.
I like that.
And they're not necessarily. It's not because you played video games you're more likely to be cultured.
You're right, Steve.
I think it's just the fact that being cultured and having access to video games, especially when we were growing up, and like especially in the time period that they're looking at, because growing up was a large part, like in the time that you're growing up was a large part of this study.
Yeah, that's true.
And it makes sense that those two things would
sort of overlap,
parallel each other, and kind of like, yeah, definitely parallel, because yes, if you have the time and the money and
resources
and the resources to go enjoy theater, go, out to museums and stuff like that, then a lot of times that will parallel with the fact that you have the money, your family has the money to buy you a video game system, and you can go play a video game.
Like I said,
and like coming out of that, you'll be in a place where you can buy a video game system.
Sure.
I would love to see a study on I guess that's what you were saying earlier, Ian, is like we'll have to wait like 15, 20 years from now
to see the next
and
iteration
see
of it. Sure.
Where like from the generation where everybody has video games, if playing video games has an effect on the things that you're interested in. And like I think that this study is trying to say that it has an effect on the things that you're interested in, but I'm not convinced by it at all.
Yes and no.
And like, don't get me wrong, I like the paper. I think that it's really interesting to see where these things overlap, but I'm not convinced that playing video games makes you a bigger consumer of art, or like makes
culture.
You more. It gives you a predilection towards like artistic endeavors or anything.
I understand what you're saying. Just let me address it briefly, because yes, I do agree that like I don't think the paper was arguing that there's a one-to-one like, oh, if you play video games, you're absolutely like.
It's
more
not,
inclined.
But it's saying like it.
It helps,
I think it's trying to tell the government or whoever they're trying to convince.
More weight to it.
Yeah,
sure. I'm just saying, like, you're right though. Like in general, like it's a broad swath of like being exposed to this one thing and being exposed, like perhaps that may spur you to be expose yourself to more culture at large.
Right.
But it's never arguing like it's like like a one-to-one like progression. Like you start with games and then you go to like
no.
you know what I mean?
If you're too poor for games, you'll never appreciate art.
Exactly. That was my only rebuttal. So I think you guys have been waiting to say something. So Grady.
No, go ahead.
Steve,
sorry about that, guys.
You're so cynical.
Well, I think I'm optimistic about people that can't afford games.
The problem is that they view video games as, and it's almost like saying that, like film, it's bulk lumping a nuanced medium into these categories. So you could have a person say they're into film, and generally I think that a majority of people nowadays would say, oh, you're into film. That sounds like something cultured. And then they could say, like
yeah,
what do you like?
Dude, Where's My Car?
I love Adam Sandler's Netflix work. And then you're like, oh, perhaps that person isn't cultured.
Clearly you're not cultured. Sure. Like,
and I think there is a bias in society against video games in general. But if someone says that, I love Grand Theft Auto, which again has a very negative bias. I don't like the plot or anything like that. Oh, I like sleeping with prostitutes and killing them afterwards and getting my money back. And I'm not trying, even though it seems like I'm making a direct parallel between Adam Sandler films on Netflix being
Ian's
like
saying that if you like killing prostitutes in Grand Theft Auto, you're a terrible person.
No. Sure. Go on.
I'm exactly, or watching Netflix Adam Sandler series, you're a terrible person.
You're basically the same person.
If Happy Gilmore is your favorite movie, you're more prone to
Netflix series.
Oh, sorry, Netflix series, whatever the fuck is.
Yeah, even worse than Happy Gilmore.
You mean all that
dumb shit that came out on
You're trying to draw a false correlation again between the two.
I'm sorry for derailing a conversation that was already derailed.
Yeah,
yes. No, but
further derailed.
That means we're back on track. Of
Double
course.
derailed.
But no, I mean, as funny as that all is,
or
humorous,
both rails are off the track.
As humorous as it may be, they're like, yes, I do agree. Of course, in more serious, like you can't like necessarily draw into the other, but you, at the same token, you'd be like, oh, we share an interest. Tell me about, let's have a discussion about share or like, oh, you are not as, you don't know as much of me, or you like the aspects I like the least. Therefore, we don't actually share a connection here upon this topic.
Sure, I mean, and that's definitely a thing. What I'm concerned about this article is that it's saying, yes, the people that could afford video games are the most cultured, and that's like,
no, I don't think it's saying that.
I think it's kind of.
That's what you.
I think it's kind of saying that.
I think you're drawing that implication from it.
See, like,
yeah,
you just use a qualifier word there.
It said that. All right, so I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it certainly said that there's a strong correlation between people that played video games and people that went to museums and went to festivals and went to like all these artistic things.
Yes.
Right? And like that's fine. That's certainly probably a correlation. I'm not sure that one is a causation of the other, regardless of which direction it goes in. I think that those things happen because of something else.
You're right.
Not necessarily because of video games or because of going to those shows or whatever.
Sure, good.
Stu, I don't think they're trying to. Well, maybe they are. Maybe I'm misreading it, but I don't believe that they're trying to draw a causation between the two.
Yeah.
What I think they're doing is they're trying to legitimize video games as a cultural phenomenon that you shouldn't be embarrassed about, or that you shouldn't look down upon. And actually, that's what I was gathering from it. Like, I remember we had this discussion about video games as art.
It shouldn't have the negative connotation that it seems to broadly have.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And like that's not something that I'm arguing against. What I'm concerned about is that this is what people are going to draw from this.
So you're setting up a straw man argument.
I'm not setting up a straw man argument.
Here's the thing.
No, absolutely not. What I'm setting up is the argument that when you say that there's a strong correlation between playing video games and like being an artist.
There is an element of causality to that. Though.
This is what they say in the article.
Let me like walk back a little bit. You used almost like, if not qualifying words, like the most culturally engaged or like the strongest. I don't think, like, I did not get that interpretation. What I gathered from this in general was that there was some kind of like overlap between the two, but it's not again, as I said, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. It's not causally related, right? You might have grown up with playing video games, and that might, on average, it seems to have spurred the swath of people surveyed here to engage in other cultures. But it's not always absolutely true.
Hold on a second. I think you're.
I'm not saying it's more. It happens more often than not in general.
I think it's kind of reversed because I think what my point was before. In video games, there's so many aspects to it. Like GTA, I love running around. I got exposed to like certain dub music that I like got into. But the thing is with video games, I think you're looking at it. I think you can reverse it and say that the draw of video games is if you're into music or if you're into not just the visceral experience. There, in a lot of video games now, you have like esoteric references, like in Fallout 4, the
Cask of Amontillado. But this is about like when you play them growing up.
No. But what I'm saying is that this might be the video game might be because you're already into this stuff or you already have a propensity for it that you could turn it around. Is what I'm saying.
I'm not sure you're addressing what I'm saying. Ian, you've been hammering away on your knee. Buddy. Please.
They are not trying to establish a causality. They're not trying to establish a correlation. They're actually arguing against. They're arguing against video games have a negative effect upon people, which I believe in your initial quote was what they.
Yeah, their abstract does.
They said that.
Yes.
No, there is no negative effect. In fact, people who play video games are cultural, perhaps more cultural, but I don't think they're trying to establish that. They're just saying that you had this negative statement. Here's an example that negates the negative statement.
I agree that the initial point of this article was certainly to say that video games do not cause a negative impact on people. And I feel like I've derailed this entire thing by what I've said, and I'm sorry about that.
Motherfucker.
But
you fucked up.
But
man.
I think that I have a point in that they
I'm not saying you don't.
In that, like, they kind of drive home the fact that, like, people that play video games tend to be more culturally active than other people and tend to be more...
They're just stating the data. They're stating the data. What they got from the data has that. I don't think they're trying to draw points.
But you don't need to.
This is what the data says.
You can state the data without saying that, right? You certainly can.
I see what you mean.
And I feel like I'm coming off as I'm angry about this article. I'm not.
Take it easy, motherfucker.
I actually enjoyed this article.
I'm angry about your.
I thought it was interesting. I thought it was very interesting to read. If only you're more
cultured.
I thought it was interesting to read, but like I feel like
Sure. Go on.
I feel like there were strange parallels that were drawn that didn't need to be drawn in it.
And God forbid.
I didn't feel they were strange parallels. But like having said what you said, I do understand where you're coming from, to be sure.
Mm-hmm.
All I'm saying is like my personal, like, again, not bias, but like it's hard to say this without using that term. It confirms something that I suspected, that I largely agree with what I'm on either side of what you're saying too. Like, again, as we stated numerous times,
it's clearly your bias. It's okay to say.
I'm just saying, like,
that's fine.
At large, you're right. Like,
it's my bias too. I agree with you.
Sure, you're saying like it's just interesting because you somehow you seem to extract something else from the data, or like something that I didn't extract from what they were saying and what they outright what they used to say what they were trying to prove, more or less, right?
Yeah.
But I do agree. Like now that you brought it up and then we discussed it a bit, I do agree to an extent that you cannot draw a 1-to-1 like link. Like it's not like a fucking like fill in the blanks puzzle. However, I do think it's like, and to Chris was saying earlier, that it just seems as a very broad, like amorphous truth that being exposed to video games in however extent in general, perhaps in many cases,
makes you better
based
than
on this
people.
survey, makes you more like affiliated, or again more. What?
That's what I'm saying.
But
I know exactly what you're going to say.
You're arguing against Scott's point.
No, but
that was what you're doing the entire time.
I mean, it's not a hold on. It's not a again. It works two ways. It's a two-way street almost. You might have been into something else culturally pertinent to you, and then maybe that got you into games, like when you were younger, right? It could have worked either way. But in either case, you were exposed to more culture and perhaps like wanted to delve into culture at large with whatever culture that may have been in general growing up. And that still roughly holds true as you aged. That's kind of all what I was getting at.
And actually to Steve-O's point, is that I think the abstract pretty much explained it explicitly, but I think there were points where it did get caught up in the data where they were so busy explaining the data that it did look like it was a 1-to-1 correlation, or it did say, or it seemed like there was a causality to it. But no, I'm just saying that when you got to the details, I could see where
I'm trying to defend your point.
Gotcha.
In that, obviously, these researchers definitely have a positive view on video games and culture.
So it seems, for sure.
So, I could see them getting, in a way, overexcited, if you will, about the data. And
a bit zealous.
Implying things that the data doesn't necessarily show.
Sure.
But I think that, for the most part, they held true to the data. And like any statistics, you can look at a piece of statistics and extrapolate whatever you want from that piece of that to fit your point.
Right.
But I will say, again, just to one last time address what your concerns may have been, Steve-O. They do admit here and there, and I have it picked out here, where they say perhaps some of this data is insufficient enough to be as solid as maybe it seems to be. So we admit that but here's and to Ian's point again, I find myself playing middleman often, and we have enough data that at least does seem to support our view and this angle on it. And here's the data itself. Mm-hmm. It's not true in all cases, to be sure. Absolutely not.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that the data says that definitely everybody who plays video games is just more artistic or anything like that. I'm just saying that is kind of the point that I draw
you saw from it. Yeah.
But then
from
again,
a lot of this article,
if you're trying to prove your hypothesis, you're definitely going to, from your study, you're going to gear to the study, you're going to pull out from your study what's going to either confirm or deny your hypothesis. So the fact that that
was never my hypothesis until I read this.
But it's their but it might have been their hypothesis.
Maybe.
And maybe they didn't state it well enough in the abstract, or maybe when they were pulling the evidence out, didn't. Go on, Ian. I think
I'll give you two things. You go first.
Ian, tell us the story.
Jump into my point I want to make.
Go ahead. Yes. Okay.
So
let's raise the point we've been wanting to make for a while.
Yes. What is a video game?
Holy shit!
No,
prepare for 45 minutes of discussion.
But here's the thing: is this is what really struck me when I was reading this.
Sure, this is what you extracted from it. Yes.
All right, I'm gonna use anecdotal evidence. I keep wanting to say apocryphal evidence, but I keep
just say apocryphal.
Both are fine.
They'll figure it out.
Yeah. My father plays Spider Solitaire almost every single day on his laptop.
I've heard stories.
Yes, I as you heard when I was
earlier today. Yes. Yeah, that's it. One story. I've heard one story.
Yes.
If I asked my father, "Do you play video games?" I think he would say no.
He would answer negatively.
Yeah. I have an Uncle Larry who is in his 70s.
And he wears a laser suit. Right? Go on.
Speaking of games.
Yes.
He friended me on Facebook, and the only thing he ever has posts on Facebook that come up is him playing slots games through Facebook. I don't think he would say he ever plays video games, even though I'm quite sure he spends 80% of his day.
According to Facebook, he spends
Larry's
most
real
of
name
his day.
Larry's got a lot of leisure time.
So you did not protect. You changed his name to protect
no one.
No, okay.
Anyway,
so
we'll call him.
It doesn't matter.
El Gary.
Go on with your.
Now here's the thing: if my other cousin plays Farmville, or used to play Farmville a lot when it was
whatever
popular,
equivalent,
yeah. And I would imagine she would say, yes, I play video games, because Farmville has more of that aspect to it. The thing is, if the average age is 40, and yet all of these older individuals I know play a lot of video games, but wouldn't consider themselves playing video games, I wonder if the age...
How it would change.
What's the real average age? 70.
No, but
average age of video game player 70 years old.
Yes, thank you, Donnie. But look, to your point, like that again is a legitimate concern because it will skew the numbers. And as I said, they do in fact incorporate they do mention that depending on how people answer, it in fact could slightly skew them, the graphs, if you will, one way or the other.
Quick funny anecdote, which ties into
it better be funny.
Which ties into something that we're
gonna laugh anyway,
something that we're doing soon.
Because you laugh at anything.
Last year we went to Mapaka to see Mapaka is a pop culture conference that we're going to all be speaking at,
as we mentioned,
this year. Chris did a talk last year, and Scott and I went to the poker table later.
Since it happened in AAC, by the way.
I sat, in Atlantic City. I sat at a table by myself and was talking to a guy who went on at length about playing Fallout 3. The guy must have been 75 years old. I was really impressed.
That is your rough assessment, though.
I talked to him for 25 minutes about Fallout 3. It was...
Sure.
And if you said you were 40, you would have played Fallout 4.
Do you play video games? Like, maybe that guy again.
He definitely would have said yes.
These are anecdotal stories and all, but I'm saying like because of all this that we said by its very nature, again, it's more as I said amorphous. Like depends on the person being surveyed what they consider a video game. To Ian's point, yes, which is an interesting sort of sub question unto itself, because that again will cut up the numbers. Yes.
If you're counting people who wouldn't consider themselves as video game players but play Candy Crush or Angry Birds or whatever the modern
or
stuff
Solitaire,
like that's the point of what they're trying to say is correct. It's simply a aspect of culture nowadays, and whether or not that makes you like what interests me is whether subgenre of what you choose to play affects how, in a sense, cultured you are. If you are more likely to play What Remains of Edith Finch, you're more likely to go to a classical music thing versus Call of Duty and going to like a metal concert. Like,
no, you're right. That's an interesting subdivision.
I think that has more to do with how cultured people are than whether they play video games or not. Because I think that as the generations progress, video games will become just a recognized...
Right, it's more of a crossover. Like, instead of going to a film, hey, let's play a game or whatever. Yeah, I agree with that. And yeah, it remains to be seen. But I do think, again, like, whatever bias I may have, which is positive towards this, I'm more in line with that. But I do want to bring up one more thing, perhaps, maybe to cover all of your points, perhaps, and something we've actually addressed on Syntax Era, like, just in general, like, throughout the seasons, is that the common perception, they write, that the medium of video games is immature seems to be far from being supported in the data.
Yeah, off. Which was it? Was it, who was this?
Ebert.
Yes.
Ebert?
Yep.
Or not even that, like, it was just not art, right? But
fuck you, Ebert.
I'm just saying, like...
Son of a bitch.
And like,
I respect your body work, but fuck you.
It's a one or two, like, little line thing. Like, they don't address it because that could be, again, as we said, a number of things we discussed just now could be its own survey, like, unto itself. Like, based on this one, like, a subdivision of it. But all I'm saying, again, like, this is a ghost echo of third-person action games because ostensibly set out to address a simple thing and have found ourselves at rabbit hole.
And now we've rabbit holed ourselves in
think of this way, like, not ironically, like, almost like it proves itself because of the fact we're immersed in video games, therefore we can culturally expand ourselves to think about all these subjects at once and attempt to address them, even though perhaps the numbers in the survey itself doesn't quite do that, but gives us a nice groundwork to do so. So, therefore...
Well said.
The final answer is, of course, video games, yes, positive, definitely make you smarter and more cultured and more elitist. At least for me. So, does anyone have anything else? I think we opened up a lot of
Close it out.
And like we said,
please.
Possibly we'll address some of it. We may make an episode or two, like, based on what we just said.
Even if anybody has anything else to say, cut them off.
And/or comment upon, give us some comments what you think if you want. But for now, like I said, I remained video game elitist, intellectually superior, and culturally more informed than everyone. Scott Thurlow, here with Chris Morgan.
Good evening.
Jane Manzer.
I was elitist before I started playing video games.
And Stephen Amosi.
I like games.
Good night.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow. Music by Stephen Hermosi. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.